Defiance is often misunderstood. It is imagined as loud, explosive, a clash of force against force, something reckless, something wild. But real defiance is often quieter than that. It is controlled, measured, deliberate. It chooses its moments carefully and then follows through without hesitation. It does not seek chaos. It creates disruption with purpose. It exists in the space between obedience and resistance. And it often looks like restraint. A man who refuses without shouting, who challenges without spectacle, who disrupts without ever losing composure. Some rebellions burn quickly, bright and gone. Others unfold slowly, methodically, until the world is forced to notice. And in those stories, defiance is not disorder, it is discipline. Before he became a legend, he was a man named Charles Boles. Born in the early 19th century, his life began without spectacle. He was not raised as an outlaw. He was not destined for notoriety. He worked ordinary jobs, farm labour, mining, small practical roles that kept him moving but never anchored. He married, started a family. For a time, his life followed a familiar pattern. Effort, responsibility, quiet survival. Nothing about it suggested what he would become. But ordinary lives can fracture, not all at once, not in ways others can easily see. A slow accumulation of disappointment, of instability, of something unsettled beneath the surface. Until one day, the path behind feels closed, and the one ahead no longer resembles what came before. And a different life begins to take shape. Like many men of his time, Boles fought in the American Civil War. War changes people, not always visibly, but in what it takes away: certainty, stability, belief in how the world should work. The war was long, exhausting, indifferent to individual lives. Men learned to endure, to adapt, to survive within systems that could fail them at any moment. When it ended, the country moved forward, but not everyone could follow. For Boles, whatever trust once existed, in fairness, in authority, had begun to erode. And once that erosion begins, it rarely reverses. It leaves behind a question. What happens when the rules no longer feel binding? Years later, a new figure appeared in California, a man who called himself Black Bart. The name itself felt deliberate, constructed, a persona rather than an impulse. He did not ride wildly into towns. He did not announce himself with gunfire. He operated with precision, planning, timing, observation. He targeted stagecoaches, specifically those of Wells Fargo Company, a symbol of growing wealth, expansion, and corporate reach in the American West. These were not random acts. They were selective, measured. He studied routes, chose locations carefully, narrow roads, wooded stretches, places where movement could be controlled. And when he appeared, it was with certainty, not hesitation, not doubt. A figure stepping into position, already knowing how the moment would end. Black Bart's robberies followed a pattern, consistent, refined. He worked alone, always alone. No partners to betray him. He often disguised himself. A long coat, a bowler hat, his face partially hidden. At times, he created the illusion of others nearby, enough to discourage resistance. But the illusion was enough, because control was his true weapon. He appeared suddenly, calm, composed, his voice steady. Passengers were rarely harmed. Drivers were instructed, not threatened. There was no panic, only a quiet understanding that resistance would not improve the situation, and so compliance came easily, only quiet compliance. The robberies ended quickly, cleanly. It wasn't violence that defined him. It was precision. At some crime scenes, he left something unusual behind. Poetry. Short verses, signed with his name. They were not long, not elaborate, but they were intentional, carefully written, deliberately placed. They added something unexpected, personality, a voice, a presence that lingered after he was gone, the work of an outlaw who did not fit the mold. These small details transformed him from criminal to curiosity, from a figure to be pursued into one to be interpreted. And in that shift, his legend began to grow beyond the robberies themselves. He became known as the Gentleman Bandit, not by his own declaration, but by reputation, because he behaved like one, polite, measured, controlled. He avoided unnecessary harm, spoke calmly, treated passengers with a kind of distant courtesy that felt out of place in the context of a robbery. He did not drink on the job, did not boast, did not linger. He arrived, completed the act, and disappeared without spectacle. In a time defined by rough outlaws, impulsiveness, and visible violence, he stood apart, not because he was less dangerous, but because he was disciplined, and that discipline made him harder to predict and harder to forget. For years, he evaded capture, not by luck alone, but by consistency. Authorities searched, tracked, followed leads that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Descriptions varied. Witnesses remembered fragments, a voice, a posture, a presence that was difficult to pin down. But patterns leave traces, even careful ones, small repetitions, habits, details that seem insignificant until they align. And eventually a mistake, subtle, almost invisible in the moment, gave him away. A piece of fabric, left behind, ordinary on its own, but connected to something larger, a thread that could be followed. And once it was, the distance between the man and the myth began to close. When he was finally caught, the legend met the man, older than expected, quieter, less imposing than the stories suggested, but unmistakably him. There was no dramatic resistance, no final act of defiance, only the slow closing of a long pursuit. The evidence had aligned. The distance he once controlled had disappeared. He did not rage, did not perform the role he had created. He admitted enough for the truth to settle. And with that, the mystery ended. What remained was not the figure in the distance, but the man himself. Black Bart was not the most violent outlaw, not the most feared, not the most powerful, but he is remembered, because he challenged expectation, not just in what he did, but how he did it. He proved that disruption does not require chaos, that resistance does not always shout. His story resists simplification. It exists in the space between control and rebellion. Some lives leave behind noise, others leave behind patterns, a way of moving through the world that lingers after the details fade. And in those patterns, his legacy remains, not as a moment, but as a method. Some stories fade, others wait to be heard.